Hello and welcome to the European Report. Here we are once again in the European Parliament in the heart of Europe. In today's programme we're discussing Iran and the recent Iranian presidential elections in which Hassan Rouhani won over 50% of the vote in Iran, in which he's been portrayed by very much of our Western media as a moderate and a reformer. So in this programme today we'll be asking how should the EU respond to the election of Rouhani as the new president of Iran. We'll also be talking about Iran's nuclear weapons program and what is the best way that the EU can deal with this great foreign policy challenge of our day. And we'll also be talking about how we can counter Iran's support for international terrorist organisations. I'm joined by an excellent panel of guests on today's programme, which is sponsored by the European Coalition for Israel. I'm joined by Daniel Hannan, MEP for the southeast of England for the Conservative Party, and also a journalist, and Paulo Casaca, who's a former Portuguese MEP and an authority, an expert on Iran, and Thomas Sandell from the European Coalition for Israel. So, gentlemen, welcome to the European Report. Daniel, first I want to start with you. I'm a constituent. I'm a member of your constituency.
Very good.
So
you're very welcome then.
Which is great to be, and it's great to meet my MEP. Can you share with us something about your background, how you got involved in journalism, and what led you to become a member of the European Parliament?
Well, I hope I'm a contingent member of the European Parliament. I'm one of that unusual minority of MEPs who would rather that my job didn't exist. I look forward to the day when there are no more British MEPs. I wish the rest every success, but I hope that I will be able to put myself out of work. And without wanting to be glib at a time of economic uncertainty, no one will have breathed a deeper sigh of relief on the day of his redundancy than I do on the day that Britain leaves the European Union. I think this is the generational question for us. Are we living under our own laws and our own people, or are we part of a bigger country called Europe?
Excellent. And I think so many British people now are coming to that conclusion that...
well, let's find out. I mean, we'll have a referendum, and either I'll win or I'll lose, and either way, I'll accept the result.
Excellent. And also, you're a journalist as well, aren't you? I mean, I've read quite a lot of your blogs on
I write a blog
Daily Telegraph,
which is hosted by the Daily Telegraph, and I used to work there when I had honest work, I was a journalist.
Excellent. And Thomas, it's great to have you back on the European Report. It's been a little while, so we've missed you. I know that you've been very involved with activities for Israel in the UN and also in Sweden. So can you share with some of our viewers some of the adventures you've got up to in the last couple of months?
Well, thank you, Simon. It's good to be back on the program, and we're very happy to have our Finnish viewers with us as well. Let me share briefly from our last event at the United Nations in May on Jerusalem Day, when we hosted a luncheon for some 30 diplomats, and we had 20 members represented. And basically we were looking at the position of the old city of Jerusalem under international law. And the interesting thing is that although members of the UN General Assembly are supposed to vote and have opinions on the matter, what was very clear during that conversation is that they very rarely have a chance to discuss the matter or have an expert speaking about the details of that very complex issue. So I think again that just by going there, by giving them this opportunity, by inviting again Dr. Jacques Gauthier, we could really make a difference. As it relates to Stockholm, we were there 2 weeks ago, and interesting things are happening in Sweden. It's the first country now where you have a Minister for Development Aid who is saying, listen, we're not going to continue to finance the Palestinian Authority if they are not interested in negotiating. So there is a proposal now from the government to cut some 20 million out of a total budget of 70 million, because they say, you know, this should be conditional, there should be a real interest for peace. And this is becoming an issue in the Swedish government. And it happened a week or 2 weeks after that we were there. So, of course, I'd like to think that there was some influence from our side, but interesting things are happening in Europe at the United Nations, and we're so happy to be able to play a little part in this very complex puzzle.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to your contribution in today's program.
About that. I'm sorry to butt in, but I just wonder whether you don't have a challenge both in the United Nations and in the European Union, in the sense that both of those organizations, and particularly this one, the European Union, are predicated on the idea that national sovereignty is a disagreeable, dangerous, and anachronistic concept. Now, Israel is the supreme example in human history of the national principle. There's nothing else remotely like it.
Correct.
Here you have a people who are stateless, scattered for 2,000 years, but who never lose the aspiration of statehood.
Correct.
Next year in Jerusalem. And then one day, miraculously, providentially, we might almost say, it happens. Now, if that's a valid story, which I think it is, but if that's your point of view, people really are better living off under their own laws and their own people in their own sovereign country, doesn't that rather challenge the whole intellectual basis of the European Union? Is it any surprise that Israel sometimes has difficulty getting a fair hearing here?
No, I think obviously I agree with the narrative of the Jewish people finding their land and having their sovereignty today. Of course, when it comes to international cooperation, we can be of different opinions of what is, practically possible, what is pragmatic. I see the problems, perhaps even more so with the UN General Assembly, where you have a majority of member states which are not democratic in themselves, trying to make democratically, binding decisions. And this, of course, is a paradox in itself. And when it comes to the European Union, I think the issue is even more complex. But yes, it is a challenge, and there is a hostility in this House towards Israel, and I'm sure Paolo and yourself
we saw it time after time, the Jenin massacre, the attacks on EU property, and so on. And for a country that occupies a very small land surface area of the world, it does make itself the target of a disproportionate number of hostile resolutions from MEPs. Let me put it as neutrally as I can.
I agree.
So that's why really we counter those lies and the propaganda on this programme, really. And Paolo, it's great to have you, a former Portuguese MEP on the programme, but also a real authority and expert on Iran. Can you share with us where your passion and knowledge about Iran stems from?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I really would wish that MEP Daniel Hannan will be able to come here many, many times. I think that we cannot blame the existence of international institutions and supranational procedures for the evil that exists in a lot of places, and especially regarding Israel. That's something I view much more as what I call patrocracy, that is the hidden power of oil money into the circuits of power and of information or misinformation, and that explain why is there so much lobbying against Israel. You cannot understand it otherwise. For instance, the main organization that directs most of the violent and actually very duplicitous, when not completely lying on Israel, is the Human Rights Watch, an organization that refuses to reveal its funds, its funding, and that is not only biased, but pursues very clear political objectives that have obviously an agenda. And this is the core of the issue, in my opinion. But regarding Iran, I actually was the founder here in the European Parliament of a group called Friends of a Free Iran. The reason why I came to be so much engaged in Iran is the reason why I wrote a book about it. It starts
which is here.
Yes, exactly. It was published in 2008. I don't know where the camera is, but the hidden invasion of Iraq. Well, it does not only speak about Iran, it speaks a lot about Israel, for instance, and Iraq and Lebanon and Egypt and so forth. But, it starts really with Iran, since I do consider from several points of view, it is the crucial country in the region, and nowadays I would say even perhaps the biggest challenge we are facing. Because, of course, Iran did not invent fanatic Muslim fanaticism. It did not. But it took it to a different level. The Islamic Revolution of Iran brought a sort of power that is fully engaged by a fanatic agenda that invented a modern way of making terrorism. Terrorism with Iran has nothing to do with terrorism before Iran. There are three things that go together and that never did before, which is, well, suicidal. Yes, you saw that before, suicidal terrorism. But if you couple it with a fanatic agenda, that is a non-compromising, an agenda where you are making some violent action for no specific objective in a negotiable way. And thirdly, when you want to kill as many people as possible, and never mind if it's women, if it's children, people that have nothing to do with it, these three elements together, you never saw them before the Islamic Revolution of Iran. And they were the ones who did it. And they did several other things that are actually landmarks in the negative history of humankind, as for instance, using massively their own children on an international war that at the time was offensive, because you can say Saddam Hussein was the aggressor up to 82, from the start of the war, 1980 up to 82, but then he asked to have peace and retreated. And it was after that Iran massively used children just to blow mines, their own children.
Remember, that was horrific.
You never saw nothing like that. I mean, Genghis Khan didn't do it. I mean, he slaughtered a lot of children, but still not his own children. So to do this, it reveals a sort of fanaticism that was not seen before. And so I think that we got into a different stage. And of course, that such a philosophy with a nuclear bomb means disaster for humankind. And of course, that Israel, which is the recurrent hate motive for Iran, obviously has all the reasons to be very concerned with it.
Absolutely. So, Paolo, we're talking about the recent Iranian presidential elections in which Husseini won over 50% of the vote. How do you interpret that presidential election, and who is Rouhani Husseini?
Well, you know, it is really fantastic that you get to the press, and all the press gets as established and credible that 72% of the Iranians did vote. I mean, this is not believable. There was never a presidential election in Iran where there was not a major fraud, major engineering, and these figures are controlled by no one, of course, no one independent. The press was not allowed. You see that the international organizations of journalists, they denounced the whole of the procedure as a farce. I mean, not only the selection, but the voting itself. I mean, nobody saw that. You just had some friendly journalists that were going around in staged events where you had a mass of members of the militia that were, herded to the polls. But I mean, it's certainly not believable that there were 72% of the Iranians voting. I would say it's very difficult to believe that even half of it, even 36%, it's very difficult to believe a thing like that. So this was certainly not what happened. What happened was that Mr. Khamenei chose Mr. Rouhani as a new leader. Why did he choose it? Well, I think that during the 2 weeks that they confronted their performances, he showed to be the best in defending the nuclear program. For instance, he explained that for 2 years he fooled the West. He was the main nuclear negotiator, and it was his main motive of campaign. He said, "Oh, I managed to fool them, and while I was pursuing with the nuclear plan, we had no sanctions. So I was much better in our job in what they call the takia, that is the heart of fooling others, of making themselves not really clear on their final objectives. And I was better than all the others." And this was the final argument that convinced Mr. Khamenei that is very stressed by a disastrous economic situation. It never got to the point where it is. Hyperinflation, bankruptcies, unemployment. And so he said, well, I really have to make a move to see if I can stop these sanctions that are really hurting. And what is the best move? Well, as always, to pretend that there is something different, to get a cleric. Because the problem of Ahmadinejad was that for the very first time, they chose someone for a top place in the institutional framework that did not have a clerical training. And this showed, Ahmadinejad could not, do the same sort of things that all the mullahs do, with a very big smile, pretending to be very peaceful, and at the same time making tremendous or horrendous things. That's what they are specialists on, and he couldn't do it, So this experiment was a failed experiment, and so Mr. Khamenei said, well, we need somebody different. Rouhani worked hand in hand with the establishment all the time. He was there in all the major decisions, in war, in terrorism, in nuclear options. So to say he's a reformist, it's really a joke.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I want to bring you in, Daniel, that so much of our British media, also European media, have portrayed Hassan Rouhani as being a moderate. But according to my notes here, that a former Iranian intelligence officer called Meshahi defected to the West in the 1990s. He's testified that Rouhani was then serving as a secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, was a member of the special committee that approved the bombing of the Jewish Cultural Center in Argentina that was blown up, that killed 85 people. Is this a man that the EU can really do business with?
Well, I think it's worth remembering that votes alone don't make a democracy. The Soviet Union had regular elections. They had elections every 4 years, and actually the parallel is quite a good one for all the reasons that we just heard from Paulo. Both systems are oligarchic in the sense that real power was vested in a small bureaucracy, either the Council of Guardians or the Politburo. And although the trappings and appurtenances of democracy were present, there was never really any question of anybody being elected who would fundamentally challenge the principles on which the regime was based. Now, I think when we talk about the Islamic Revolution, we overemphasize the Islamic bit rather than the revolution bit. I think that the Iranian Revolution will one day be seen as an epochal event, a world-changing event, on a par with the French Revolution of 1789 or the Russian Revolution of 1917. In common with them, it spilled out immediately from behind its borders. In common with them, it refused to recognize any of the established norms of international behavior. The Jacobins and the Bolshevists and the Ayatollahs all began by saying, we don't recognize any of your rules. We don't recognize the law among nations. What was the signature act of the Iranian Revolution? It was the US Embassy siege. Now think of what message you send out if that's how you begin. If the US and Cuba were to go to war tomorrow, there would be a peaceable evacuation of diplomatic personnel. In the Second World War, when mutually opposed ideologies fought to extirpate each other, diplomats were evacuated through neutral countries. By seizing sovereign US territory, what the mullahs were doing was saying, your rules don't apply to us. We recognize a higher authority than the traditional way of doing business among nations. And they got away with it. Because you'll remember that there was simultaneous embassy siege the other way around of an anti-revolutionary group in London around about the same time. Absolutely. Of course, the British government behaved as a responsible member of the international community. We took the embassy back and handed it over with a check for the damages that we'd inflicted while breaking in with the SAS. Right? So what did that say to the Ayatollahs? It said you can have it both ways. You can still claim the privileges of being a recognized state under international law without needing to reciprocate. And that is how they have carried on from that day onwards, sponsoring militias and terrorist groups, not just on their doorstep, not just in Lebanon, but in the Balkans, in Central Asia, the old Silk Road Khanates, sponsoring terrorist activities as far afield as London and, as you just said, Buenos Aires. Why Buenos Aires? Right, what possible interest does Iran have in Argentina? It's about as far as you can go from Iran and still be on dry land. Right, why Buenos Aires? Precisely because it was so far. What they were doing, again, was saying we can go wherever we want. We can strike at will because your rules don't apply to us. So I think it's terribly important to understand the nature of the regime we're dealing with. If within that matrix, within those parameters, someone qualifies as a reformist, then that's really no different. I'm just old enough to remember in the 70s how there were occasional different candidates in the Soviet bloc and people would get excited because this set of communists had won instead of that communist and it was a step in the right direction. Well, maybe it was within the terms that then pertained. But if the question is how do we deal with Iran, I don't think that there is much profit investing any hopes in an internal reform from within the system. There may be an avenue for exploring an internal revolution within Iran, but it isn't going to come out of the regime itself.
And Thomas, I just want to bring you in here. Isn't there a great danger in the way that the West, particularly the EU, the United States, has embraced Rouhani's election victory, that this could be bad news for Israel, as it would seem that the sense of urgency regarding Iran's nuclear weapons program can be put on the back burner. The West is celebrating that Ahmadinejad is no longer in power. They don't have to deal with this evil, belligerent dictator, but they believe that they can actually deal with Rouhani. Can you explain how Israel can actually confront this deceptive challenge by the Iranian regime?
Yes, I do agree with you and all of you that this is a deception. There's probably no reason to hope that Rouhani would be any different than his predecessor, other than in one way. Yes, I think he is more, he comes across as more reasonable. He comes across as more moderate, and I've seen so many adjectives used about him, almost saying he's a charming person. Charming persons sometimes have a tendency to can be, very rotten inside, and time will tell, of course. And I think in this case we need to see some signs within the next few weeks, 1 month, given the fact that he is so well acquainted with the nuclear program. I mean, he's been a negotiator. He knows everything. He doesn't have to have a briefing to say, well, what's this fuss all about? He's been in the middle of it for a long, long time. My impression is, and this is just, I'm not claiming to be an expert like Paolo, but my impression is that maybe the supreme leader is just trying to buy time. And what better way would there be to buy time than to present this moderate reformer? And as we see already in Western media, there seems to be this deception that, maybe he is different. Maybe we should, even as you quoted the former British foreign minister, maybe we should open up normal relations and lift trade sanctions with Iran. No, I think it's very dangerous. I think it's very dangerous, and we should not be deceived.
Yeah. So how should Israel respond to this new challenge in dealing with diplomats and dealing with the EU to talk about the sense of urgency that Israel feels that Iran is so close to having nuclear weapons? And let's not forget that it was not just Ahmadinejad who's called that Israel should be wiped off the state of the earth, but the supreme leader of Iran, Khomeini, has sanctioned a religious and legal edit that says that effectively that Israel should be destroyed and the Jewish people should be wiped out, which is essentially calling for genocide.
Yeah, I don't think there should be any change of strategy, and I haven't seen any indications in Jerusalem that they intend to change their strategy. The urgency is just as imminent today as it was a week ago, before the elections. I recall that the Canadian Foreign Minister just was on the record saying that we're probably looking at a window of 2-3 months maximum for this so-called diplomatic process. After that, things will have to change. He didn't elaborate, and I don't think any one of us or in this House would want to elaborate on what the options are, other than to say that we need to keep all the options on the table.
Absolutely. So we're down to the last 2.5 minutes of this section of the programme. So if either of you want to chip in and saying how important it is that we stop Iran's nuclear programme.
I don't want to flog to death the Soviet analogy, but there was a moment in the Soviet Union when someone was elected within the system who created the avenue for change, although he hadn't intended it, which was Gorbachev. Now, our response was not to say this is a great guy, let's build him up, he will be the answer to our problems. Without meaning to, he set in train a series of events that led to the complete overthrow of the regime. Now, there are plenty of forces within Iran that are anti-regime. There are national minorities and Azeris and others, there are Sunnis, there are the student protesters, there are the remnants of the old opposition, from communists to monarchists and everyone in between. This is not a country where the middle class was completely eroded. There are plenty of people there who aspire to live in a different kind of society. And in order to stimulate internal change, I think we need to be very careful about how we calibrate our response. Margaret Thatcher was very quick to recognize that Gorbachev was an opportunity. But her response was not to say, therefore, let's disarm, let's withdraw our troops from Germany. She saw that if we played this one correctly, we may be able to liberate hundreds of millions of people from tyranny. Now, there is a spectrum of responses, with a military response at one end and complete normalization at the other. How you play, where you draw the line on that spectrum is a very delicate question, and there are people who do this professionally. But I think it would be naive for us to assume that all our problems are over because there's been an election from within this regime.
Last week, Jack Straw, our former British Foreign Secretary, wrote an article in your newspaper, and according to my notes, entitled "Iran's New Leader Offers Hope for the Region." In the article, he says, our government should seek to reopen full diplomatic ties with Iran. As a leading and prominent MEP, do you believe that we should restore full diplomatic ties with Iran without any preconditions?
I think that would be premature. Jack Straw is a decent man, and his motives here are completely sincere. He is continuing the policy he initiated as Foreign Secretary. He made, if memory serves, 3 formal visits as Foreign Secretary to Iran, and his calculation was that engaging with the Ayatollahs would draw them into the Comity of Nations. And by and large, he was backed by the European Union and by his fellow European foreign ministers. There was a major Atlantic difference in approach. The US was much tougher, much more committed to the idea of sanctions and the readiness to deploy proportionate force if necessary. The European approach was much more jolly them out of their nuclear ambitions. Now, as I say, I don't for a moment question his motives, but if we look at the facts, it's very hard to deny that his policy was a failure. The British government and the other European governments, 3 of them acting in concert, invested a lot of diplomatic capital in seeking to normalize relations with Iran, and there was no move either towards denuclearization or democratization, or even renunciation of the militias and terrorist organizations supported abroad. The hardest thing in life is to accept that you've made a mistake. It's always much easier to say, well, one more push, we're nearly there, you know. And there's always an apparently plausible reason for thinking that things are going to be different from now, in this case, the recent election. I would say if we look at the thing objectively, there are not the reasons for optimism that Jack believes. And I think it would be naive to begin to soften our position when we have seen no de-escalation from the other side. This is a really critical point. I'm all in favor of détente, but it has to be on both sides. When you look at how Iran has been behaving just in recent years, you know, while Jack Straw was Foreign Secretary and since, I'm not going back to the Buenos Aires bomb or anything, but seizing British Marines from Iraq, attacking our boat in international waters from HMS Cornwall. You know, de-escalation has a cost as well.
Yes.
And if you're not responding proportionately, you invite more.
Yeah. And Paolo, what's your response to opening up full and diplomatic relations with Iran? What's the danger that entails?
Well, I do not discuss the motives of Mr. Jack Straw, but reality is you had never had a person that was so much engaged with Tehran as Mr. Straw. That was passing, I think that it was the country that he actually visited most of the times when he was Foreign Secretary. I think that Mr. Straw was one of the most essential persons in misleading public opinion on Iraq and Iran, trying to sell the idea that the nuclear threat was in Iraq and not in Iran. I don't know about his motives, but I would say that he misled completely the public opinion. He never explained why did he mislead, and I think on this basis nothing that he says should have any credibility. Besides that, Gorbachev has been called as a parallel, but I think that regarding the European public opinion, Western public opinion, a much better parallel is actually Hitler. There is a fascinating book. Actually, I think that everything is writing on this time. Jan Kershaw, that is seen as the authority on Nazism in the 30s, British academic historian, and one of his books, Making Friends with Hitler. And Lord Londonderry, Britain's Road to War. It's outstanding because he explains how the British media, the mainstream British media, thought of Hitler as a moderate, thought that the Times at the time, when Hitler was nominated, they said, fantastic, a moderate as a chancellor. And he describes during the whole of the 30s how the press never understood what should have been clear to them, and how they always try to create illusions on any sort of negotiations that made no sense whatsoever. I think that to read this is to understand what is happening now, because it's very, very similar. The press is misleading itself out of their wishes of, for instance, this issue, no one questioned the figures coming from Tehran on the elections. This is absolutely fantastic, because they have been seen time and again to be false figures in the past. Why should they be now good ones when no independent authority was allowed to oversee the procedure? So I think that this is the major obstacle we have right now. It's not really Iran, because Iran is trying to step back, understanding that it cannot go with this present economic crisis aggressing the rest of the world directly. So they have to be a bit calm. I think that they want, of course, to have to mobilize the radical public opinion, Islamist radical public opinion against Israel. But their tactic objective is more to have control of the Gulf. It's Saudi Arabia in the short term more than Israel. That's what we have to look at.
Can I just come back to also like to comment on your analogy on the Cold War, actually, Daniel, and I would say I think it's very important, especially from our perspective as a Christian organization interested in Israel and the region, to make the following comment. See, in the Cold War, when you had détente, there was the mutual threat of destruction. So it was not in the interest of a secular communist Russian to see his country being destructed. What we have here is something completely different. We have a leader who is speaking in the UN General Assembly in a mode of a Islamic revivalist meeting, ushering in the 12th Imam. And what needs to precede the coming of the 12th Imam is the complete destruction, which will then bring about the Islamic Caliphate. I mean, this may seem like a strange discussion that doesn't belong in a studio in the European Parliament, but this is the official line of the Supreme Leader and of the President, and something that they are not shy about in any way. I mean, if I was then, I would be a much better tactician and say, well, better not speak about this to Western media. But he's speaking about it openly in the UN General Assembly in New York. So I believe, so what we have is a leader who doesn't calculate it as a risk if Iran would be completely destructed, but on the other hand, as not only an opportunity, but a precondition for their ultimate political objective. And this, of course, with our Western worldviews, it's a bit difficult to grasp. But I believe it's important, and also in this program, to put it on the table and say, well, this is the type of political animal that we are dealing with.
The question then becomes, what's the apt response? Now, unlike I should think many of the guests you've had on this program, I was very skeptical of the Iraq War. I was one of the few British conservatives who was against going in, not on peacenik grounds, but I thought it would be contrary to our strategic interests. And although I supported the overthrow of the Taliban, I never supported the prolongation of our mission in Afghanistan. And among the reasons why I was against the one intervention in its entirety and the prolongation of the other, among the many reasons, was that we have removed from either flank of Iran powers that were balancing them. I always saw Iran as a much bigger potential problem, partly for the reason that you touch on, that there was an ideology that was necessarily belligerent. It's not particularly because of or rather not solely because of the religious element. It's what Lenin would call exporting your internal contradictions. A state which is undemocratic and which can't rely on majority support has an incentive to keep picking fights, and it's just how they've behaved throughout history. So I always saw Iran as the bigger problem. One of the consequences of the Iraq War is that in practical terms it is now impossible to summon any popular support in any Western country behind another military intervention in that region. The idea has been discredited. But coming back to my idea of a spectrum of responses, if on one extreme of that spectrum you have the complete normalization of relations, and on the other you had a direct military intervention, there are many escalating points along that line. There are sanctions and blockades, seizure of assets, there are sponsoring of internal opposition groups, either financial or more direct sponsorship. There are targeted strikes. There's a whole series of points along that line. And if we are serious about ensuring a nuclear-free region, or at least ensuring that nuclear weapons are not in the hands of people who might use them, then I think we have to be prepared to consider all the points along that line. And as I say, I'm not someone who is naturally a hawk in foreign policy matters. I think that most of our military interventions in that region have been mistaken. But here is one that it would be irresponsible not to consider in extremis, because we are dealing with a state that is close to securing means to deliver mass destruction.
Yeah, and Paolo, you wrote this book here, The Hidden Invasion of Iraq by Iran. Can you tell us how Iran operates, how it controls and manipulates other states and nations in the Arab world, and also wants to create and establish this Shia crescent? And how do we actually confront the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, I think, let me tell you that basically I think that Daniel's instinct is very correct. I would say that, well, if you were to throw out Saddam, of course, that the most important concern would be to make sure Iran would not take over. But this was not the case. There was a very good documentary from BBC that shows that right from the beginning, the West and the United States sponsored death squads that were actually the Iraqi section of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Right from the beginning, and of course with things giving the power directly to Tehran, more than, I mean, you could think of a response. It would be very difficult because there was no civil society in Iraq, but you could conceive it intellectually at least. But no, the West clearly gave the power to Iran, and Iran acted through the section of its Revolutionary Guards, because from the start, Shia ideology has been, or the extreme way of looking at the Shia religion was the leitmotif of the regime. So right from the Iranian Revolution, they started creating both Lebanese and Iraqi sections, like there would be their own. And of course on terrorism, Iraqi sections of the Revolutionary Guards were mainly attributed tasks in the region, in the Gulf region, in Iraq properly, but not only in Iraq, in Kuwait and in Gulf countries. You will see a lot of terrorism that was done by the Iraqi sections of the Revolutionary Guards. Threats to the United States, for instance, that were made by the groups that the United States empowered and financed and armed in 2003. And the Lebanese were the ones chosen for a more global activity, because you find Lebanese all over the world. Lebanese are one of the peoples that migrate the most. So you have them wherever you need them. You need them in Buenos Aires, because at the time the issue was they felt Menem had not respect and engagement to help them on the nuclear issue. That was the reason why they bombed Buenos Aires. And you have Lebanese at hand. You need them in Nigeria, you have Lebanese. You need them in Asia, in Thailand, you have Lebanese. They are all over. Terrorism is the number one instrument of Iran. But it's not only terrorism. They act all over. I think that they are perhaps the most intelligent manipulator of press, politicians, and civil society organizations. You see that, for instance, you see that in Iraq, but perhaps even better in Afghanistan. Nobody speaks about it, but the presence of Iran in Afghanistan is overwhelming. They have, I don't know how many TV channels, how many bogus civil society organizations that claim to be for human rights or for whatever. They are present everywhere. This is Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, Syria now, very slowly people are understanding this is an Iranian war. I mean, they took control of the regime. Actually, one of the things that the press has not been saying, but lots of testimonies are certifying, in Syria now, you have Shia militia Hezbollah, of course, everybody knows about that, but Iraqi as well. Both of them are side by side, and the whole of the war is managed from Tehran. This is a Tehran war for control of the Middle East. That's what it is, and that's the way we should look at it. And we shouldn't have any illusions of what is going on. And we should be asking all of these organizations that are making, Human Rights Watch, for instance, is a case in point. I followed it, I studied the way that Human Rights Watch distorted completely reality in Iraq. Human Rights Watch, people do not remember, but it was the only organization that claimed that there was a duty to invade Iraq. They made a sort of doctrine out of United Nations. They were the ones who did it. And of course, they just 1 year afterwards, they tried to make people forget about it. And they were saying, oh, we are against invasion and so on and so on. But they were the ones who did it, and they made several pieces of pure propaganda of the Iraqi sections of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards that really are now controlling the country. Iraq is in the hands of Iran, and this is to a large extent by the lack of vision from the West that did not understand what was the issue.
And Daniel, you recently wrote an excellent article on your blog on the Telegraph. It was very interesting to read. Let me get on to the question. I'll just say what the title was saying. It says that you quoted in your article that the situation in Syria is very, very grave, and that what we could see is that this could lead to a Shia-Sunni sectarian conflict throughout the Middle East, and also that this threatens to destabilise the West's main allies in the Middle East, Israel, Turkey and Jordan. And the fact that the Iranians have deployed something like 4,000 troops. They've deployed the Iranian Revolutionary Guards to prop up Assad's bloody regime. Isn't it time that the European Union prescribe Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation and the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards?
Well, it's a very tricky question, that, because the European Union did prescribe Hamas, and yet it continues to funnel huge funds into Hamas-controlled territory, getting around the letter of its own prescription by doing it through NGOs. So they say, oh, well, we're not funding it. It's on the prescribed list of terrorist organizations, so we can't pay Hamas. But, I mean, a lot of EU money is, in effect, going... What they say is we're paying for Palestinian officials. It's state building. I mean, a lot of these officials are in prison. They're receiving their salaries while serving their sentences for terrorist offences. So I'm not sure that the mere act of prescription is as significant as you suggest. It's more a question of what the attitude behind that act is. And I think it is important to understand the nature of what we're dealing with. However, that said, in Syria, I think our options are limited. It's human nature to say, well, these are the bad guys, and therefore let's talk ourselves into thinking that the opposition are the good guys. There is, in Syria, a element which is pro-democratic and pro-secular and liberal. But I'm not sure how much public support it commands. The middle class in Syria has been systematically eroded by years of dictatorship. Civil society has been wrecked. And I don't know how much future there is, any more than in Iraq, in backing the small number of people who are talking our language. The hardest thing in politics is to accept your own impotence in some situations. And I think Syria may be such a situation. We have a series of bad outcomes, and we can choose which one is less bad than the other. Yeah. But the idea that there is somebody in Syria who, with the right amount of military backing, could create a kind of democratic civil society there, I think there is a measure of self-delusion there.
Yeah, and I think we're down to the last 5 minutes of the programme, which has gone extremely fast. Thomas, how do you believe that the EU should respond to the threats and the challenge posed by not only Iran's nuclear weapons programme, but also their support for international terrorism?
I'd like to turn the question around a little bit. I think this is the best possible time for the Western world to rally around Israel. You just look at the region and you see it's trouble to the south, it's trouble to the north. You can't see, as Daniel was explaining, even in Syria, you can't even see a viable alternative. So what do we have in the middle of this region? We have a beacon of hope, a stable democracy, a vibrant economy. how can it be that the European Union is so obsessed with say, settlements and this and that, and focusing so much energy on criticizing Israel? I think this house should be the house in the world which would rejoice and say, well, isn't that amazing that in this environment of only repressive regimes where things are going from bad to worse, there is at least one beacon of hope. Let's rally around Israel. So regardless of how, yes, I think, Hezbollah should be banned. It should definitely be the case, although it will not solve all the questions. But as I say, I'd like to look at it from a different angle. Let's this be a European spring when we suddenly realize that we have a friend in the region where democracy works. Stop this nonsense of criticizing this and that and making life difficult for the only democracy.
Absolutely. And Paolo, I think we've got less than 5 minutes, so I'd love to have your views and comments of how the EU can actually confront the challenge and the threat posed by Iran.
Well, I think that a different attitude is necessary. Of course, gradualism is always important, and facts. I mean, if we are seeing clear and verifiable steps from Iran withdrawing terrorism and withdrawing aggression and withdrawing from imprisoning opponents. Of course that I think we have to react and this is a positive sign. But the most important, and here Daniel is completely right, I mean, Hezbollah is financed by the European budget. I, as a member of the European Parliament, raised the issue in the Budget Control Committee using, exactly as Daniel said, front organizations that are bogus, civil society. And this is the problem. I mean, Europe has to understand that we have to finance and support democracy, not totalitarianism.
Absolutely.
This is the fundamental issue. And in Syria, the problem is that we left, in the beginning, it was a more liberal revolution encompassing everyone. But we allowed the bad guys to take control of the scene. Exactly as in Iraq. The very first time I was in Iraq, I mean, people were delighted with democracy, parties, ideologies. I would see, taxi drivers listening to the stations broadcasted from Europe that were speaking on abstract concepts of democracy. And they were fascinated by it. It was amazing, but they very rapidly forgot about all of it because what they saw was terrorism, was massacre, was a joke of a democracy. And this is the main issue. I think that a cultural revolution in Europe is necessary.
Yeah. And Daniel, we've got the last 2 minutes, so I'll let you have the conclusion for the programme.
Well, on Syria, I remember traveling in Syria during Assad Senior's dictatorship, and I was touched by countless small acts of kindness. As in many dictatorships, people overcompensate for not being able to rely on the state by being exceptionally generous and hospitable one to another. So I'm not unmoved by what's happening there. I think of people I knew. But we have to be realistic. You can't make policy on the basis of saying I feel strongly about this and therefore because I feel very strongly about it there must be some good. It's one of those situations where intervention is more likely to do more harm than good. If you're funneling arms into a region like that, which is entropic, then the arms will end up spilling out of it. Finally, to come back to Israel and the European Union's response to it, I mean, I think you're right. We should recognize countries with which we have things in common: market economy, parliamentary democracy, rule of law. Also, I think we should recognize that Israel's long-term future depends on having stable neighbors. Syria, up until now, was a much less dangerous neighbor to have than the Gaza Strip, because although it was deeply hostile to the existence of the Jewish state, it was a state in control of its own territory. It didn't have freelance rocket launchers. And ultimately, I think the security of Israel depends on having not well-disposed states. That may be too much to hope for on its border, but at least sovereign, functioning states, even if they're not terribly democratic, that are not in the state that Lebanon or the Gaza Strip is in. And that's the best we can hope for in Syria in the short term, is that you end up with some government capable of restoring order.
Gentlemen, I just want to thank you so much for joining me on today's European report. It's been an absolute pleasure, so thank you. And I want to thank you for watching at home this very special edition of the European report, in which we've discussed the dangers posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran and how the West should not be fooled into deception in terms of Iran, in terms of opening up negotiation with Iran's nuclear weapons program that could actually bring this into reality, that would actually be a game changer in the Middle East. So I want to thank you for watching today's program here in the European Parliament on the issue of Iran. Thank you and goodbye.